In the hilly South African province of Natal, a lovely road winds its way up from the village of Ixopo to Carisbrook, a journey of 7 miles. This misty vantage point looks out over one of the fairest valleys of Africa, where the native birds sing and the grass is dense and green. The lush grass of the hills clings to the rain and mist, soaking up the moisture, which in turn feeds every stream. Although cattle graze here, their feeding has not destroyed the land, and the few fires that burn have not harmed the soil. As the hills roll down to the valley below, however, they become red and bare. The grass there has been destroyed by cattle and fire, and the streams have all run dry. When storms come, the red dirt runs like blood, and the crops are withered and puny. These valleys are the homes of the elderly, who scrape at the dirt for sustenance. Some mothers live here with their children, but all the able-bodied young people have long since moved away. The Reverend Stephen Khumalo, a native Zulu, sits in his house writing when a young girl appears with a letter. After sending the girl to the kitchen for some food, Khumalo wonders who may have sent the letter. It is from Johannesburg, but so many members of his family have been in the city for so long without word that it could be from any of them, and he cannot recognize the handwriting. Among others, Khumalo's brother, John, lives in Johannesburg, as does their sister Gertrude, who is 25 years younger than Khumalo, and Khumalo's son, Absalom, who went to the city in search of Gertrude and has never returned. Apprehensive, Khumalo calls to his wife, who confirms that the letter is not from their son. Finally, Khumalo's wife musters the courage to open the letter and reads it aloud in faltering English. It is from a minister in Johannesburg named Theophilus Mzimang, who reports that Gertrude is ill and who requests that Khumalo come to the Sophiatown section of Johannesburg. Khumalo's wife asks what Khumalo intends to do, and he reluctantly tells her to bring him the money they have saved for Absalom's education at St. Chad's, the local school. Khumalo's resolve falters when he holds the money in his hand, but his wife comments that there is no longer any point in saving it. Absalom has gone to Johannesburg, and those who go there do not return. Khumalo reacts angrily to his wife's suggestion that their son will never come back, and although she protests, saying that Khumalo is hurting himself, he continues to deny her claim angrily. When he realizes that his words are wounding his wife, however, Khumalo calms down and reconciles himself to the inevitable. He and his wife pool the St. Chad's money with the rest of their savings, resignedly giving up the money they intended to spend on clothes and a new stove. Khumalo apologizes humbly to his wife for his unkindness, then heads off to his church to pray for guidance and forgiveness. His wife watches him through the window with a weariness born from years of suffering. Khumalo waits for the Johannesburg train at Carisbrook. Generally, this journey is shrouded in mist, which some find to be an ominous sign and others find a mysterious prelude to adventure. Khumalo, however, pays little attention to his surroundings. He is anxious about his sister's health, the potential costs of treating her illness, and the chaos of Johannesburg, where there are many buses and one can be killed just by crossing the street, as happened to a 12-year-old boy who was an acquaintance of Khumalo's. His gravest concern is his son. The train arrives, and Khumalo bids farewell to the companion who has helped him bring his bags to the station. As Khumalo boards the train, his companion passes on a request from a man named Sibiko, whose daughter accompanied a white family to Johannesburg and has not written since. Khumalo says he will do what he can. He boards one of the train's designated non-European carriages, where he searches in vain for a fellow passenger of the same social class as himself. He then goes to the window to say farewell to his friend and asks why Sibiko couldn't make his request himself. His companion explains that Sibiko does not belong to Khumalo's church, but Khumalo proclaims that they are all of the same people and should not hesitate to go to one another in times of trouble. He states grandiosely that he will check on Sibiko's daughter, although he will be busy, as he always is when he's in Johannesburg. Since Khumalo has never been to Johannesburg before, this statement is a fib, but it is the desired effect of impressing Khumalo's fellow passengers. The train to Johannesburg travels a full day and night, climbing through many hills and villages. The regions Khumalo passes through are unfamiliar to him, with foreign landscapes and signs written in Afrikaans, which he does not speak. The great mines of South Africa come into view, and Khumalo's fellow travelers, many of whom are miners, explain how the mines are painstakingly excavated. They point out the great pulley that hoists the broken rocks, and Khumalo is awestruck by the scale of it all. Overwhelmed by the modern surroundings, he keeps mistaking the passing landscape for Johannesburg, but his fellow passengers laugh and tell him of buildings in Johannesburg so tall they can barely describe them. The train arrives in Johannesburg, where Khumalo moves gingerly through the crowds that swarm throughout the station. Outside the station, the rush of traffic so terrifies Khumalo that he stands petrified on the sidewalk, unable to decipher the traffic lights. Speaking in a language Khumalo does not understand, a young man appears and offers to help Khumalo find his way to Sophiatown. The young man leads Khumalo to the bus station, where he tells Khumalo to wait in line for the buses while the young man buys him a ticket. Eager to show his trust, Khumalo gives the young man £1 from his precious savings. He begins to suspect that something is wrong, however, as soon as the young man turns the corner. An elderly man takes pity on the helpless Khumalo and informs him that his money has been stolen. When it turns out that they are both headed for Sophiatown, the elderly man invites Khumalo to travel with him. He guides Khumalo safely to Mzimang's mission house, where the young Reverend Mzimang opens the door and introduces Khumalo's companion as Mr. Mafola. Mr. Mafola takes his leave as Khumalo, safe at last, enjoys a cigarette and reflects on the days to come. Mzimang informs Khumalo that he has found a room for him with Mrs. Lithaby, a local churchgoer. Khumalo uses a modern toilet for the first time in his village. He had heard of these devices, but he had never used one. The two men dine with the other priests, a group that includes both blacks and whites, at the mission. Khumalo speaks sadly and lovingly about his village, and about how both Exopo and its neighboring villages are falling into ruin. One white rosy-cheeked priest wishes to hear more, but he excuses himself to attend to other affairs. The other priests, in turn, tell Khumalo that all is not well in Johannesburg. White people have become afraid because of a rise in crime. They show him a newspaper headline describing an attack on an elderly white couple. Nor are whites the only victims, they say, and they tell him how an African girl was robbed and almost raped. After dinner, Mzimang asks Khumalo about Gertrude. Khumalo replies that his sister came to Johannesburg with her child to find her husband. Mzimang regretfully informs him that she now has many husbands. She sells cheap liquor and prostitutes herself in the worst area of Johannesburg. There have been crimes committed at her home, and she has been in prison. Mzimang also tells a distraught Khumalo that Gertrude's son lives with her, but that her home is no place for a child. Mzimang has heard nothing about Absalom, but promises to ask about him. As the sorrowful Khumalo goes to pray, he asks about his brother, and Mzimang informs him that John Khumalo is now a great politician but has little use for the church. Mzimang explains that he does not hate the white man, in part because a white man brought his father out of darkness by converting him to Christianity. He confides to Khumalo, nevertheless, that he believes that white people have broken the tribal structure without leaving anything in its place. Mzimang explains that some white men are trying to rebuild the country for all people, but that they are not enough, and are held prisoner by the same fear that rules the rest of the country. He says that Father Vincent, the rosy-cheeked priest at dinner, is the best person to ask about such things. Khumalo retires to his lodgings and marvels that only 48 hours ago he had been with his wife. Khumalo sits in his lodgings, writing a letter to his wife and listening to Gertrude sing as she helps Mrs. Lithaby around the house while her son plays in the garden. Mzimang arrives and brings Khumalo to the shop of his brother, John. Although John does not recognize Khumalo at first, he seems pleasantly surprised to see him. Khumalo learns that John's wife, Esther, has left him, and that John has since acquired a mistress. John tries to explain why he stopped writing home and then asks Khumalo if he may speak in English. In a strange voice, he relates that he has been seized by an experience in Johannesburg that has made him see things differently. In the village, John says, he was a nobody and had to obey the chief, whom he calls ignorant and a tool of the white man. In Johannesburg, he says, He is free from the chief, although he adds that the church serves a similar function in keeping black South Africans down. Things are changing in Johannesburg, John proclaims, and his voice deepens with emotion as he decries the wealth and power of the mines owners and the poverty of the miners. Although the bishop condemns this economic discrepancy, he lives in a fancy house, which embitters John toward the church. Mzimang questions John's fidelity to his former wife. Before John can respond, Khumalo intervenes and John's mistress silently serves tea. Khumalo confesses that listening to John is painful for him, both because of John's manner of speaking and because much of what he says is true. He tells John he has found Gertrude and asks about Absalom. John says he does not know where either Absalom or his own son are, then remembers that they were working in a textile factory in Alexandria. Mzimang and Khumalo take their leave. As they head to the textile factory, Mzimang explains to Khumalo that much of what John said is true, and that John is one of the 3 most important black men in Johannesburg. Mzimang also suggests, however, that if John were as courageous as he maintains, he would be in prison, and Mzimang observes that power can corrupt even the most dedicated politician. At the textile factory, the white men who manage the plant are helpful, stating that Absalom has not worked there for 12 months. Khumalo and Mzimang meet a friend of Absalom's who says that Absalom used to live with a Mrs. Ndlela in Sophiatown. The 2 priests find Mrs. Ndlela, who tells them that Absalom has moved to Alexandria. After Khumalo steps outside, Mzimang asks Mrs. Ndlela why she seems so sorry for Khumalo, and she reveals that both she and her husband felt that Absalom kept bad company. Mzimang and Khumalo catch a bus to Alexandria from Johannesburg. As they board the bus, however, they are stopped by Dabula, another of the 3 most important black leaders in Johannesburg. Dabula tells them that blacks are boycotting the buses because the fares have been raised and persuades them to walk the 11 miles to Alexandria. As they walk, they accept a ride from a white driver, who goes miles out of his way to help them. While waiting to go to Shantytown, Khumalo spends time with Gertrude and her son. He and Gertrude have little to say to each other, but he takes comfort in telling his small nephew about Natal, and Gertrude finds a friend in Mrs. Lithaby. In Shantytown, Khumalo and Mzimang ask a nurse about Absalom's whereabouts. The nurse sends them to Mrs. Hlatshwayo, with whom Absalom was staying. She tells them that Absalom was sent to the reformatory. As they walk to the reformatory, Mzimang tries to comfort Khumalo, saying that he has heard good things about the reformatory. To Mzimang's surprise, Khumalo asks him what he spoke about with Mrs. Mkhize, Absalom's landlady in Alexandria. Mzimang reveals that she told him that Absalom and John's son often came home late with bundles of white people's possessions. At the reformatory, a young white man tells Mzimang and Khumalo that Absalom was a model student, but that he was discharged a month earlier because of his age, good behavior, and the frequent visits from his pregnant girlfriend. Despite Khumalo's worry that the young man will be unsympathetic to a black man who speaks no Afrikaans, the young man is quite helpful. He promises to take Mzimang and Khumalo to Absalom's new home in Pimville, where, the young man says, Absalom is saving money and preparing to marry his girlfriend. The young man, Mzimang, and Khumalo go to Absalom's house in Pimville, where Absalom's girlfriend, still a child herself, tells them that Absalom left the house a few days earlier and has not yet returned. Khumalo asks her what she will do, but before she can respond, Mzimang speaks harshly to the girl and tells Khumalo that her problem is one that Khumalo cannot solve. When Khumalo protests that she carries his grandchild, Mzimang scoffs at the idea and wonders out loud how many other children Absalom may have. After informing them that Absalom has been absent from work for many days, the young man leaves them at the gates of Orlando, where Mzimang apologizes to Khumalo for his unkind words. Khumalo forgives him and asks Mzimang to take him back to the girl. Mzimang persuades Khumalo to take a few days' rest while Mzimang goes to Azanzalini, a colony for the blind. Khumalo and Mzimang then enjoy a quiet evening at the mission house with Father Vincent, who listens to Khumalo's stories of Natal and tells them about his native England. The tranquil evening is shattered, however, when another priest enters with a newspaper whose front page announces the murder of Arthur Jarvis, a white engineer and crusader for the rights of black South Africans. Jarvis, the paper reports, was at home with a cold when intruders knocked out his servant and shot him at close range. The paper states that there are no leads, but police hope the unconscious servant will be able to furnish some information upon awakening. The paper also states that Jarvis was in the midst of writing his treatise on the truth about native crime when he was murdered. The article closes by saying that Jarvis leaves behind a widow and 2 children, a 9-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. Khumalo remembers seeing Arthur as a boy, small and bright, with his father. The Jarvis farm overlooks Dachshund. He is weighed down by a sudden, inexplicable fear. Mzimang tries to reassure him that the odds of any connection between Absalom and the murder are small, but Khumalo is inconsolable and too tired even to pray. A speaker notes that no one can enjoy the beauty of South Africa amid so much violence. The speaker adds that throughout the nation, thousands of voices cry out what must be done. This speaker argues that there should be more police, and another speaker argues that if black Africans had more rights, there would be less crime. Some advocate that more schools be built in the black districts, where fewer than half the children go to school, but others say that schooling blacks only produces criminals who are more clever. The past laws, which require native South Africans to carry permits in white areas, might work, says one man, but his friend counters that these laws can't be enforced and imprison innocent people. Some argue for greater segregation, others for greater education and opportunities. Disagreement is the only certainty, and the white population lives barricaded behind their fear. Khumalo and Mzimang travel to Ezinzulini, a colony where white South Africans care for blind black South Africans. Mzimang has work to do here, so Khumalo sits by himself for some time and meditates. The thoughts of his grandson being born out of wedlock, his son's thievery, and the murder bring him to despair, but he takes heart at the thought of returning to Dachshund with new humility. Khumalo's newfound high spirits evaporate as he admits to himself that the ways of the tribe have been lost forever. When Mzimang returns and finds Khumalo in despair, Mzimang reminds Khumalo that despair is a sin. Khumalo is comforted by the help given to the blind in Ezinzulini, and especially by Mzimang's rousing sermon to the blind. He knows that Mzimang speaks to him when he says God will not forsake humankind. Some people criticize Mzimang for using his preaching gifts to teach patience while so many of his people die, but Khumalo feels spiritually refreshed. Gertrude's furniture, the final remnants of her past, are sold at a great profit, but Khumalo feels only fear when he sees Mzimang approach Mrs. Lithaby's house with the young man from the reformatory. The man tells him that his fears have been justified, that Absalom is in jail for the murder of Arthur Jarvis, and that Absalom fired the shot. John's son was with Absalom during the crime, and Khumalo goes to break the news to his brother. Devastated by the news, John goes with Khumalo to the mission, where Father Vincent offers them help, and the young man from the reformatory leads them to the prison. In the prison's visiting room, Khumalo and Absalom are finally reunited, but Absalom cannot look his father in the eye. He shifts and squirms and blames his condition on bad company and the devil, to Khumalo's disgust, and tears up when the young man reproaches him for rejecting the lessons of the reformatory. Absalom states that he shot Jarvis, but he explains that he fired only because he was afraid, and maintains that he still wants to marry his girlfriend. At the prison gates, Khumalo meets John again, but John is no longer in despair. He will get his son a lawyer, he says, adding that there is no proof that his son was even present at the time of the murder. Khumalo, John cruelly states, will not need a lawyer. His son is guilty and cannot be saved. The young man, embittered by his disappointment with Absalom, refuses to advise Khumalo and defiantly asserts that his work at the reformatory is important. He drives off, John leaves on foot, and Khumalo is left alone. Father Vincent, he decides, is his only hope. Before Khumalo can seek out Father Vincent, the man from the reformatory returns to apologize for his harsh language. He advises Khumalo that he will need a lawyer because John is untrustworthy. He says they need someone who will make sure John's claim that his son was not there does not hurt Absalom, and who will argue that Absalom fired because he was afraid. Khumalo, who has begun to find his way around Johannesburg, goes to Pimpville on his own to visit Absalom's girlfriend. She has not heard the news about Absalom, and when Khumalo tells her, she is devastated. Khumalo asks Absalom's girlfriend if she still wishes to marry Absalom, and though she says she does, she seems confused. Khumalo presses her further, and she explains that her father left her mother because her mother was always drunk. She disliked her mother's new boyfriend, so she ran away from home. Even though Absalom's girlfriend is still almost a child herself, she has had 3 lovers since she left home. Her lovers, whom she calls husbands, have all been arrested. Khumalo is angered by her promiscuity and harshly asks her if she would accept him as a lover. Frightened and confused, she says she would. Shocked by her answer, Khumalo covers his face with his hands, and she begins crying and lamenting. Ashamed of his behavior, Khumalo comforts her and asks if she would like to come with him to Ndachani and live with his family as their daughter. She gratefully responds that she would and assures him that her only desire is a quiet life. Khumalo is surprised to find himself laughing with pleasure, and after making Absalom's girlfriend promise to tell him if she ever regrets her decision, he goes off to find her a new place to stay. Although Gertrude and Mrs. Lithaby get along, Mrs. Lithaby worries that Gertrude has a strange carelessness about her and is too friendly with strange men. Still, Mrs. Lithaby admires and respects Khumalo, and she agrees to let Absalom's girlfriend move in. Khumalo, ecstatic with Mrs. Lithaby's reply, plays with his nephew. Absalom's girlfriend moves in and behaves with appropriate modesty. One day, however, Mrs. Lithaby comes upon Gertrude and Absalom's girlfriend laughing in a way she does not like. She calls Absalom's girlfriend to her and tells her that she must not laugh in this way, and the girl immediately understands and agrees. Gertrude continues with her strange behavior, though she now leaves Absalom's girlfriend alone. Khumalo goes to visit Absalom, who tells him that Absalom's friends are denying that they were in the house with Absalom. Absalom gradually comes to agree with his father that his companions are not true friends. Absalom is pleased, however, by the prospect of having a lawyer, and he promises Khumalo that he will tell the lawyer nothing but the truth. He is also happy with the arrangements Khumalo has made for Absalom's girlfriend. On his way out, Khumalo passes Absalom's lawyer, a dignified white man with the air of a chief. Some time later, the lawyer, Mr. Carmichael, visits Khumalo at the mission house. Absalom's defense will be based on the truth, he says, and he will need as much information about Absalom's character as possible. After Mr. Carmichael leaves, Khumalo frets about the legal costs, but Father Vincent informs him that Mr. Carmichael will take the case pro Deo, or for God, meaning he will take case for free. Though their lives somewhat resemble each other's, Absalom's girlfriend and Gertrude represent 2 distinct models of womanhood in the novel. Whereas Gertrude, enmeshed in her seedy Johannesburg life of prostitution and liquor selling, is cynical, Absalom's girlfriend, who is young and unwise to the ways of the world, is optimistic. This difference in attitude is reflected in their different reactions to Khumalo's invitation to return with him to Ndachani. Gertrude initially turns down Khumalo's invitation because she considers herself too sinful. But Absalom's girlfriend, who, like Gertrude, is promiscuous, immediately accepts Khumalo's offer because she attributes much of her misfortune to the circumstances of her past and not to her own actions. Gertrude sees no hope for her situation, while Absalom's girlfriend has complete faith, perhaps naively, that blessings such as marriage and family can rehabilitate her. The narrator repeats the descriptions of the hills of Natal that open book eye. The valleys are lovely, and the grass is thick and green. Looking down upon it all is High Place, the residence of a white farmer named James Jarvis, the father of the slain Arthur Jarvis. Jarvis hopes that rain will soon fall on his dry fields. The hills of Ndachani below are dry and barren from over-farming, and no one knows how to solve the problem. Jarvis ponders all the possible solutions to the over-farming. If only the native people would learn how to farm, he thinks, and if only those who were educated stayed to help their people instead of running to the city. Of course, his own son, Arthur, decided to leave the farm and become an engineer in Johannesburg, but he doesn't begrudge Arthur his decision. Standing on a ridge to look for rain clouds, Jarvis sees a police car approaching his home. He thinks that it must be one of the Afrikaner policemen. Afrikaners are white South Africans of Dutch descent, largely considered by families of English descent to be of a lower class. Though he's of English descent, Jarvis believes that the local Afrikaners are a fine people. Two policemen, Van Jaarsveld and Benedict, come to him with the shocking news that his son has been shot and killed. As Jarvis copes with the announcement, they offer to make arrangements to get him to Johannesburg as quickly as possible. He accepts their offer, and while one of the policemen calls to arrange for the flight, Jarvis breaks the bad news to his wife, who breaks down crying and screaming. Mr. Jarvis and his wife fly to Johannesburg and are greeted by John Harrison, the brother of their son's wife, Mary. They travel to the house of John and Mary's parents, where they meet Mary, her mother, and her father, Mr. Harrison. Jarvis, his wife, and Mary get into the car with John to go to the mortuary. On the way there, John tells Jarvis that Arthur was an advocate for the rights of the country's natives, an issue on which Mr. Harrison and Arthur did not see eye to eye. After seeing Arthur's body, the family returns to the Harrisons, where Jarvis joins Mr. Harrison for a drink. Mr. Harrison tells him that condolence messages have poured in from every part of the community, including from the Prime Minister and Mayor. He tells Jarvis that Arthur could speak Afrikaans and Zulu, that he was interested in learning Sesotho, a native language like Zulu, and that some wanted him to run for Parliament. Arthur protested the housing conditions of the mines workers, ignoring warnings that he was jeopardizing his job as an engineer and maintaining that the truth was more important than money. Mr. Harrison calls Arthur a real crusader in his efforts for others, then reveals that all of white Johannesburg is scared stiff by the attacks. Though neither he nor Mr. Harrison share Arthur's politics, Jarvis is moved by these stories about the respect his son inspired and about his son's courage. Jarvis goes to bed, where he shares the stories with his wife and expresses his regret that he did not know more about his son while Arthur was alive. He falls asleep in his wife's arms, tormented by the question of why his son was murdered. Jarvis sits in his son's house and looks at all his son's books and papers. He notices that his son seems to have particularly admired Abraham Lincoln. Jarvis finds a letter addressed to Arthur from the boys' club in the town of Claremont. He finds part of an article that his son was writing. In this article, Arthur argues that it is unacceptable to keep black South Africans unskilled in order to provide labor for the mines, to break up African family life by housing only black workers but not their families, to deny black Africans educational opportunities, and to break the tribal system without creating a new moral order in its place. Absorbed in his son's ideas and interested in learning more, Jarvis takes a copy of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He then walks into the hallway where his son was killed and out of the house. Absalom's trial begins. Europeans sit on one side of the courtroom and non-Europeans sit on the other. The narrator notes that in South Africa, the judges are treated with great respect by all races, but though they are just, they often enforce unjust laws created by the white people. Absalom's two accomplices plead not guilty, but Absalom's lawyer says that Absalom will plead guilty only to culpable homicide, since Absalom did not intend to kill Arthur Jarvis. The prosecutor denies this petition, however, and Absalom is forced to enter a plea of not guilty. The other two defendants, John's son, Matthew, and a man named Johannes Pafuri, look sad and shocked while Absalom tells his side of the story. Absalom says that Johannes planned the robbery after hearing a voice that told him a time and date. After entering Arthur Jarvis's house, Absalom says, Johannes confronted Arthur's servant and demanded money and clothes. When the servant called out for his master, Johannes hit him over the head with an iron bar. Arthur burst in on the robbers, and Absalom fired his gun because he was frightened. He and his companions ran away. The judge asks Absalom why he brought the revolver, and Absalom says it was for his own protection. He also tells the court that Johannes brought the iron bar and claimed it had been blessed. The judge interrupts to ask Absalom if his father would bless such a weapon. Absalom then resumes his narration. After the murder, he went to Mrs. Mckaysa's house, where he met his accomplices, then buried his revolver in a plantation field. He says that anyone, Mrs. Mkhize, Matthew, or Johannes, who denies this claim is lying. He then says that he prayed for forgiveness. He spent the following day wandering around Johannesburg and ended up in a friend's house in Germiston. When the police found him there, they questioned him about Johannes, but Absalom told them that he himself shot Jarvis and indicated where the gun might be found. He meant to confess earlier, but he waited too long, and when the police arrived, he realized that waiting was a mistake. The court adjourns, and outside Khumalo sees Jarvis. He says nothing, however, because he feels that there is nothing he can possibly say to him. The trial receives little publicity because the front pages all carry news that gold has been discovered at Odendaal Trust. There is excitement at the stock exchange and talk of a second Johannesburg being built. Before the discovery of gold, the land was wasted, but the engineers' patience has finally paid off, and the stock prices are soaring. The English say that it is a shame that these prodigious feats of engineering should have such ugly Afrikaans names, and that it is a shame that the Afrikaners cannot see that a bilingual state is a waste of time. In the spirit of unity, however, they keep their thoughts to themselves. An anonymous conservative voice takes over the chapter, noting that some do-gooders want the new profits to go towards subsidizing social services or higher wages for the miners. This voice notes that it is a pity that these people, most of whom have no financial standing to speak of, are so good with words, such as a strange priest named Father Beersford. The thinking of these people is muddled, the voice says, and the narrator unjustly accuses the people of Johannesburg of being greedy when many of the town's prominent citizens actually give money to charities and collect art. Another voice begins, this time one that is more liberal. It praises the work of Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, who suggests that the new mines should house whole families in villages rather than house male workers in crowded compounds. Money is not everything, the voice says, and the world does not need a second Johannesburg. Jarvis and his wife go to visit one of Mrs. Jarvis's favorite nieces, Barbara Smith. While the women go into town, Jarvis stays behind to read the newspaper's reports on crime and the gold rush. There is a knock at the door, and when Jarvis opens it, he is surprised to see a frail black parson in tattered clothes. The parson seems shocked by the sight of Jarvis and begins trembling so much that he is forced to sit down on the house steps. Torn between compassion and irritation, Jarvis holds the parson's stick and hat while the parson struggles to his feet and collects his scattered papers. The parson explains that he is there to check on a friend's daughter who had come to work for the household. Jarvis refers him to the house's native servant, then realizes that the man before him must be the parson, known in Zulu as the Mfundisi, of Ndachani, Jarvis's hometown. Jarvis tells the parson that he may wait for the mistress of the house to return, then asks the old man why he's so afraid of him. The Mfundisi, who does not give his name but is obviously Khumalo, reveals that it is his son who murdered Arthur Jarvis. Jarvis leaves abruptly to walk around the garden, and though he's obviously very emotional when he returns, he informs the parson that he is not angry. They share a memory of Arthur when he was young, and Khumalo tells Jarvis how saddened he's by the Jarvis family's loss. Mrs. Smith returns and curtly informs Khumalo, through a Jarvis, that the girl he seeks was fired after she was arrested for distilling liquor. She has no idea where the girl is now. The parson leaves, and when Mrs. Jarvis asks Jarvis why he seems disturbed, Jarvis makes a cryptic comment about a visit from the past. John Khumalo addresses a crowd with his powerful voice. His voice rolls out beautifully, like thunder, but his comrades Debola and Tomlinson listen with scorn and envy, for it is a powerful voice not backed by their courage or intelligence. John argues that the wealth from the new gold that has been found in South Africa should be shared with the miners. The crowd roars with John as he declares that the miners deserve higher wages and better conditions. Some of the white policemen on guard say that John should be shot or imprisoned. The narrator notes that while some leaders want to go to prison as martyrs, John does not, since he knows that in prison there is no applause. Toward the end of his speech, he states that he and the crowd do not want to trouble the police. Stephen Khumalo and Mzimang are among the listeners. Khumalo is impressed, But Mzimang is skeptical. He knows that John lacks courage, and wonders why God should have given this man a gift of such oratorical skill. Still, he is thankful that John lacks heart, because he believes that if John backed up his words with action, he could plunge the country into violence and bloodshed. They move forward to hear the next speaker, Tomlinson. Jarvis and John Harrison, who have also been at the meeting, leave for Harrison's club. Jarvis refuses to discuss what he has just seen, simply stating that he does not care for that sort of thing. A police captain reports to his officer. He states that John Khumalo is dangerous and comments on the power of his voice. The officer comments on Khumalo's voice as well, saying that he must go here at one day. The captain wonders if there will be a strike. The officer replies that a strike could be a nasty business. The narrative voice returns and states that there are rumors that the strike may spread to the railroads and the ships. The narrator adds that such a terrible prospect makes some white people think about how much they depend on black labor. The judge delivers his verdict on Absalom's crime. While a Zulu interpreter translates, the judge explains that even though Arthur's servant identified Johannes as having been present during the breaking, there is not enough proof to convict Johannes. Although he acknowledges that Absalom's testimony is vivid and that it was corroborated by plenty of circumstantial evidence, the judge also wonders out loud whether Absalom named his accomplices to alleviate his own guilt. For these reasons, the judge declares Johannes and Matthew not guilty, although he hopes there will be further investigation into their previous criminal activities. The judge turns his attention to Absalom. He agrees with many of Mr. Carmichael's arguments regarding Absalom's remorse, the honesty of his testimony, and his youth. He also mentions Carmichael's argument that the destruction of tribal society and the conditions of native life in Johannesburg contributed to the crime. The judge explains, however, that he must uphold the law, even if that law was made by an unjust society. If Absalom had truly fired in fear, the judge says, the charge of murder would have to be dropped, but he says the fact that Absalom brought a loaded revolver into the house and that the servant was struck with an iron bar demonstrate an intention to kill. Therefore, he finds Absalom guilty of murder. The judge believes there are no special grounds for mercy, which means that Absalom is sentenced to hang. Only the Governor-General in Council can lessen Absalom's sentence. The young man from the reformatory, who has attended the trial, crosses the color line that separates whites and blacks in the courtroom in order to help Khumalo exit. Father Vincent, Khumalo, Gertrude, Mzimang, and Absalom's girlfriend go to the prison so that Absalom can be married. After the marriage, Absalom and his father have a final meeting. Absalom sends his remembrances to his mother and directs his father to his last savings and possessions, which will help with the upkeep of his son. Khumalo bitterly mentions that he finds it hard to forgive Matthew and Johannes for abandoning Absalom. The time comes for Absalom to be taken away, and he begins to weep because he is afraid of dying. Two guards have to pull Absalom from his father's knees when it is time for Khumalo to leave. Outside, Absalom's girlfriend joyfully greets Khumalo as her father, but he's too distracted to pay much attention to her. Khumalo goes to say goodbye to his brother. After some tense pleasantries, John tells Khumalo that he intends to bring Matthew back to his shop once the trouble has passed. Khumalo asks John where his politics are taking him. John replies that Khumalo should not interfere with his politics since he does not interfere with Khumalo's religion. Khumalo warns John that his words may get him in trouble with the police, and when he sees fear in his brother's eyes, Khumalo presses further in order to hurt John. Khumalo lies and says that he has heard that a spy has come to John's shop and has been reporting on the secret conversations John conducts there. When John shakes his head at the thought of being betrayed by a friend, Khumalo angrily cries out that his son had two such friends. John drives him from the store, and Khumalo walks away, distressed that he has failed in his mission to warn John against the corrupting influence of power. The Jarvises bid their farewell to the Harrisons, who agree with the sentencing and wish the other two men had been convicted as well. Jarvis agrees. At the station, Jarvis slips John Harrison an envelope containing a check for £1,000 for the boys' club that John and Arthur founded. There is a farewell gathering for Khumalo at Mrs. Lithaby's house. Mzimang tells Khumalo that he has decided to renounce all of his possessions and become a monk. He gives Khumalo his savings, over 33 pounds more money than Khumalo has ever possessed. Khumalo falls to his knees in amazement and decides to send John a letter to apologize for his actions. The following morning, he wakes Absalom's wife for the journey to Duchy. In Gertrude's room, however, he finds her son and her clothes neatly laid out, but Gertrude is gone. The trains carry Khumalo, Absalom's wife, and Gertrude's son back to Duchy. They are greeted warmly, and Khumalo's wife refers to the young girl as her daughter. As they walk to Khumalo's home, they encounter people from the village who tell Khumalo how happy they are to have their Mfundisi back. They confess that they are worried about the drought that is starving their crops. A friend tells Khumalo that the Jarvises have returned and that the villagers are aware of what Absalom has done. When Khumalo arrives at his church, he finds a gathering of followers already assembled, and he leads them in a prayer. He asks for rain, for the welcome of Absalom's wife and Gertrude's son, and for forgiveness for Gertrude and Absalom. After the service, he speaks with his friend from the railroad station. Khumalo tells his friend all about Gertrude and Absalom. He says that since the news will soon be known, his friend should spread the word. Khumalo worries that he's too disgraced to lead his congregation, but his friend assures him otherwise. When his friend asks about Sibiko's daughter, Khumalo tells his friend that the girl is lost. Khumalo comes home in time to wish Absalom's wife goodnight, then sits up with his wife discussing Mzimang's gift and other, sadder matters. Khumalo prays that his village can be restored. He visits the village chief, but he cannot share in the chief's optimism, as it is all too clear that the white men made the chiefs powerless and left mere figureheads in their place. The chief shares Khumalo's concern about the departure of the young people of the village for Johannesburg but has no new ideas about how to change things, and he concludes the interview by sadly resolving to try to bring these issues up with the local magistrate once more. Khumalo visits the school headmaster, but he fears that the headmaster's teachings about farming are more academic than practical. He considers them pleasant theories that do not prevent the valley from drying up and its children from dying. As Khumalo mulls over his disappointments, Arthur's son rides by on horseback. He is staying with his grandfather. He greets Khumalo with uncustomary politeness and asks to see his home. The boy asks for a drink of milk, but there is no milk in Duchy. He asks what children do without milk, and Khumalo tells him that some children are dying. The small boy practices his Zulu with Khumalo and rides off. That evening, a worker from Jarvis's farm delivers milk to be given to all of the small children in Duchy. Overwhelmed by the suddenness of this gift, Khumalo laughs until he is sour. 4 letters are delivered to Khumalo's household. 1, from Mr. Carmichael, explains that Absalom will not be given mercy and will be hanged that month. Another is from Absalom. Khumalo and his wife read this letter together. Absalom writes that he's comfortable in the Pretoria prison and is being ministered to by a priest, but he knows now that he must die. He writes simply and directly about his life in prison and states that he now understands that he belongs in Duchy. The 3rd letter is from Absalom for his wife. The 4th letter is from Mzimang, and when Khumalo reads Mzimang's descriptions of Johannesburg, he is surprised to find himself missing the city. As Khumalo and his congregation prepare for a confirmation ceremony at the church, one of Jarvis's workers brings word that Jarvis's wife, Margaret, has died. As the women lament, Khumalo writes a letter of condolence to Jarvis in which he mentions that he suspects that Margaret is partly responsible for the great contributions Jarvis is making to the village. He questions whether to send it, wondering whether Arthur's murder is somehow the cause of the sickness that killed her. He decides, however, that Jarvis is a man who stays by the path he has chosen, and sends the letter. At the confirmation, rain leaks through the roof of the church and onto the congregation. Afterward, Khumalo and the bishop meet privately. The bishop thinks that Khumalo should leave Duchy because his son killed Jarvis's son, and because Absalom's wife became pregnant out of wedlock. He has found a position for Khumalo where no one will know of these things. Khumalo is crushed but swallows the bishop's arguments and obeys. As he and the bishop are talking, However, a timely letter arrives. Jarvis has written back, thanking Khumalo for his sympathy and assuring him that Arthur's murder had nothing to do with his wife's illness. He wants to build a new church for Indochine. Elated, Khumalo shows the letter to the bishop, and the bishop agrees that it is God's will for Khumalo to stay in Indochine. Khumalo comes home to find his wife and other church members hard at work on a sympathy wreath for the Jarvis family. He sends a local man to gather the appropriate flowers for the white man's wreath. Napoleon Letsitsi, the agricultural expert, teaches the people new ways to plow. He plans to build a kraal, where the cattle will be kept. The villagers work with new spirit, but the ones who have had to give up their land are sullen. The future, Letsitsi tells Khumalo, will hold even bigger changes, and he hopes that the people will see the need for these changes themselves and not have to be convinced. Khumalo praises Letsitsi, but Letsitsi is worried that it will take time for great improvements to happen. Letsitsi also speaks eagerly of the time when the people will not need to take the white man's milk but will instead be able to provide milk of their own. Khumalo is disturbed by this sentiment, but Letsitsi is insistent. He is grateful to Jarvis, he says, and to other good white men, but though they pay his salary, he works for Africa and not for them. It is the white man's policies that have made such improvements necessary, he says, and these efforts are only repayment for a debt long overdue. Letsitsi assures Khumalo, however, that he is not there to make trouble. Khumalo gives Letsitsi a final warning about hatred and power and is glad to see that the young man is interested in neither. Khumalo stands for a minute gazing at the stars and reflecting that these new, radical politics have come too late for him. There are some who might call him a white man's dog, Khumalo thinks, but it is the way he has lived, and he has done with it what he can. Khumalo has a place he goes to contemplate the weightier things in life, and on the night before Absalom is to die, he travels to this mountain top to keep vigil. On the way, he meets Jarvis, who informs him that plans for the new church will arrive shortly. Jarvis thanks Khumalo for the sympathy wreath. They speak of Arthur's son, then reminisce about Arthur himself. Jarvis asks where Khumalo is going, and when Khumalo replies, he says that he understands. Khumalo thanks Jarvis for all he has done for the village and tells Jarvis that he has been touched by God. In his place of solitude, Khumalo goes over Absalom's letters from prison, in which Absalom assures him that if he could return to Indochine, he would. Khumalo repents for his own sins and gives thanks for the many blessings he has received during his time of trouble. He wakes up and turns his mind to the suffering of others, the missing Gertrude, the people of Shantytown, his own wife, and above all, Absalom. Khumalo reflects on the plight of Africa and Mzimang's whispered fear that by the time the white man learns to love, the black man will have learned to hate. He sleeps and wakes up just before dawn, wondering what his son, who will be hanged when the sun rises, is doing at that moment. The light rises, and the narrator wonders when the light of emancipation will come to the forsaken land of South Africa.